From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health. And now here is our host and producer, Hilda Labrada Gore.
Hey, Hilda here. How can we be sure that viruses don't exist? What about the patient zero who transmits diseases at the start of nearly every pandemic? And do germs and microorganisms exist? What's making us sick if not these things? This is episode 473, and our guests today are Drs. Mark and Samantha Bailey. You may have heard them on last week's podcast. Today we invited them back to answer frequently asked questions about all things related to viruses. They explain how the medical community has been unable to prove that viruses exist, or that they make us sick. They answer a number of questions, including those I asked at the top, and whether antibiotics are ever a good idea, and if germ theory and terrain theory could possibly coexist. They also go over a number of the pages from the virus or pandemic playbook, and they point to the work of a New Zealand doctor who has been their inspiration and a personal influence for how they shore up their health. Before we get into the conversation, I want to let you know that the Weston A. Price Foundation has a popular brochure called The Timeless Principles of Healthy Traditional Diets. In it, there are pictures taken by Dr. Weston A. Price, along with guidelines for living the Wise Traditions way. To celebrate 1 million copies distributed of this brochure, we are giving away 5 free copies to each Weston A. Price Foundation member who requests it. Just go to our website and log into the private section for members only. And if you are not a member, you can join today. It's only $30 for the year if you use the code POD10. So do it. I'll put a link in the show description so you can become part of the Wise Traditions family. And welcome. This is Hilda Labrada Gore, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Sam and Mark.
Thank you so much, Hilda.
It's lovely to be here.
So we had you all on before, and it was wonderful. And then I realized, oh my goodness, we need to ask you the most frequently asked questions about viruses. So let's start with the blame game. When it comes to viruses, usually there's some patient zero or a place from which everything originated that gets a lot of attention, and then all the fear begins. Talk to us about that process.
Yeah, well, there's almost like there is multiple levels of blame that goes on. And this is really to distract people from what actually causes illness, which we might get into later. But the sort of double deception that goes on is, firstly, they blame germs, whether they exist, like bacteria and fungi, etc., or whether they're fabrics of the virologist's imaginations, like the virus model. So that's the first level of blame. The second level of blame is that then they say that there are vectors, things that are making these germs come into the population. So one of those things might be animals, the so-called zoonotic diseases. And the other one you mentioned there is this concept of patient zero. Now, patient zero is another fantastical concept that they've come up with no basis in reality. And this is apparently their ability to trace back a pandemic to who the first case was, who started this whole thing. And I mean, it's so preposterous because you think, how could there be a first case of something new that just appears? And of course, that's why they use the animal model as well and say that it must have come from animals first.
Oh, you're so right. In other words, it's like the old adage, which came first, the chicken or the egg? How is a virus suddenly going to appear in a person from out of nowhere?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why they distract people and say that it came from the jungle, it came from animals, etc.
And they're doing filthy things,
yeah.
with animals.
and you're like, well, where did it come from in the animals, etc.? And it's this ongoing, there's just nothing underneath it. It's turtles all the way down. But what they use is this mythology with the concept of patient zero. So they did it most famously, perhaps, with HIV. And in our book, we give the example of Gayton Dugas, who was a gay flight attendant who, they say, brought AIDS to North America. And the CDC published a study, and it looked very technical, and it had a diagram of all the contacts that Gayton had had with various men over a period of about 5 years. And they said, here we go, it's the smoking gun. He's the guy that brought it to the United States. And following that, I mean, we exposed this paper and show the audience why it's completely pseudoscientific. They had no evidence whatsoever that he had a new disease or that he was spreading it around. The problem is, though, is that once they published that story in the 1980s, the mainstream newspapers picked up on it and people started writing books about it. And they said, oh my goodness, Gayton Dugas, he came across North America, he spread it coast to coast. That's why the United States has this problem now. And I mean, ironically, later on, they said, oh, actually, it wasn't him. We've got a different hypothesis about why it spread. But you can see that the damage was done because the public at that stage had been sold the story that this young, good-looking guy had moved around America, and because he was a flight attendant, he was traveling into the US and Canada, etc., and everywhere he was stopping, he was spreading this new virus around. And again, it's incredible. No scientific basis to the entire thing, but yet the mythology takes, and the public get this idea into their minds that, oh my goodness, there's a patient zero, and they could appear amongst us at any time and then spread deadly diseases around. So we've got to be vigilant. We've got to be on the lookout. And what we point out is that in the 1980s, people in 1990s, some people were like, oh, it's all very well, but I'm not part of a particular risk group, so this is not going to affect me. By the time we got to 2020, I'm sure that everybody could see, they said everyone's at risk, okay, because we have a patient zero in Wuhan, and this thing, nobody is safe, basically. Yeah. And they took this concept, this bogus concept of patient zero, and once again sold it to the world, but this time on an absolutely grand scale. And in our book, we talk about the so-called search for patient zero with COVID-19 and how there's not a scrap of science behind it. It's all just them coming up with theories and opinions, and then it's appearing in mainstream media as though these are facts, basically. So, yeah, that's why it's really important to know what is Virus Mania talked about this too, but we extend this concept in the final pandemic. What is the playbook? What are the things you need to be aware of? What are the terms, whether it's patient zero, asymptomatic transmission, super spreader, all of these terms that they've introduced? How do they use them, and why is there absolutely no scientific basis to any of them?
Well, yeah, the one that always got me with hopefully the final pandemic, was the asymptomatic carrier, because it made it so that you had to be afraid, as you said, hypervigilant and keeping your distance from everyone. This is for Joe Q Public. I was not feeling that way because I didn't believe it. But those who were convinced, wow, what a great term. Asymptomatic carrier means that anyone could possibly have this and infect you and cause your sickness or death.
Exactly. And I think that what you're talking about, the blame game, it just takes it to another level, doesn't it? Where people who are well are fearful of complete strangers because they blame them. They think, I could be a victim of this virus. They could infect me. It's never something that you've done wrong. It's never something that you've done to yourself. You don't have to take any responsibility with viruses.
And I think, yeah, as you know in the book, Hilda, we introduce, because people don't seem to realize this, that the first so-called asymptomatic carrier transmitter was actually introduced more than a century ago in the form of typhoid Mary. And strangely enough, though, there's really odd things around the story, and I don't think anyone should take it all as factual.
I want to hear more about this, but I have to tell you, Joel Salatin always used to bring up typhoid Mary, and I thought, who is typhoid Mary? He was always like, people look at me like I'm a typhoid Mary. I'm like, what does that mean? So do tell us the story.
Well, there are so many suspicious things surrounding the story. Now, if you read Wikipedia or some sort of mainstream source or even scientific publications, they talk about this as though it's all fact, basically. And if you actually look back at the foundational evidence like we did, there's actually very little available to make any deductions about what actually took place. Firstly, the problem is that nobody reported on the so-called Typhoid Mary.
Should you explain who she was, like what the story was?
Oh, yeah. Tell us the time frame, too, because it's been lost in the history books, and I'm curious about it.
Yeah, well, I was just about to say, one of the strange things was it was 3 decades, apparently, after she was causing all these problems that the first report appeared. So that's odd in itself. You'd think that they would have reported on this at the time, but we have this secondhand report 3 decades after these events supposedly took place. So Mary Mallon. She immigrated to North America from Europe in I think it was the late 1800s, early 1900s, and was then a cook for many wealthy families in New York area. And what they claim is that all of these households that she was working in were coming down with typhoid. And they say that it was all traced back to her, that she was dirty, basically. She was constantly full of bacteria and she was shedding them out, and it was getting into the food in the household and making everybody sick. And they said she went around multiple houses and was just causing this absolute epidemic. And they say she caused dozens of cases, maybe hundreds of cases, until they finally apprehended her and prevented her from working as a cook ever again. Now, there are so many problems with the story. Like, you can't even verify the stuff because, as I say, we only have this one report written by a so-called sanitation engineer, George Soper, which was written, as I say, 2 or 3 decades after these apparent events. And if you actually read his report, it's really strange because he says he didn't even need to do tests or anything. He knew that Typhoid Mary, or Mary Mallon, was spreading it everywhere just by looking at her. But then he also goes on to say that she looked incredibly healthy and robust and she wasn't affected whatsoever. So here we come into this contradiction because keep in mind, in the early 1900s, this whole thing with germ theory is pretty new and the public, most of the public are not really on board with it necessarily at this stage as they may be today. And anyway, it was a major problem because people could see that the person that was supposedly carrying this disease should be sick because in the late 1800s with Pasteur and then with Koch's postulates, the whole thing was based on the fact that if you found the microbe in the person, they basically had the disease. They were incredibly unwell. But clearly Mary was not unwell. And so this is the first introduction in history of the asymptomatic transmitter, the fact that, we've got these people that are completely well, but they're spreading it everywhere and they're ending up killing people or making them incredibly sick. But what we encourage the audience to do is to examine the pivotal original evidence like we did and say, even we didn't include this in the book, but to be honest, one of the photographs looks completely doctored. And back in those days with the black and white photography, apparently it shows Mary in an isolation ward, but the photo looks so suspicious but because we can't confirm 100% that the photo was doctored, but I'm sure many people would look at it and conclude the same, that this photo looks like it's completely fake. She doesn't look like she's in a hospital and etc.
But I suppose the blame game comes in part because of human nature. We like to have an understanding, and if we don't have it, we come up with one, a framework with which to understand sickness. And it's just so much easier to be able to point the finger at Typhoid Mary or this fellow with AIDS or patient 0 in any of these cases, or even an animal or a bat, because then I can feel safe and secure knowing, well, at least I have an idea of someone I can point the finger at. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it goes on everywhere. I can think of my own anecdotal stories of when I was working as a doctor, going in and having runny nose. And there was a fellow colleague I worked with who was a triathlete and she was going to a competition and she got really angry at me and she said, "You're going to make me sick and you're going to affect me. And I'm not going to run and I'm not going to race well." And it's this blame of thinking someone else is giving it to you. You are not responsible.
And I think, Hilda, what becomes so bizarre, and I think people who have woken up to the fraud of germ theory, etc., and virology in recent years are starting to see what the problem is here. So you can talk to someone who's obese, they eat at McDonald's every day of the week, eating this terrible food and terrible diet. They hate their job, so they sit in an office all day with complete psychological discontent. They have a really unhealthy home life. They don't do any exercise. But all of that can be forgotten because what they need to worry about is germs. That's what makes them really sick.
And make sure you've got hand sanitizer on hand.
Yeah, and once you see the fraud for what it is, you think, oh my goodness, this person honestly thinks the best thing that they can do is wear a face mask and stay away from people and take vaccines or antibiotics, etc. And unfortunately, they take no responsibility for their own health, and the blame game goes into extreme overdrive because when they do get sick, they say, oh, well, I guess it was when John came to work and he sneezed on me, or I guess it was because not enough people got the vaccine, etc. All of these completely bogus concepts, and they just don't get it. That's not what's making them sick.
Now, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, Mark. You were talking about germs and bacteria and fungi. Do you believe that those things exist? And if so, how do they affect our health and our immune system?
Yeah, so we make the distinction. There are microorganisms that do exist, so we can see them under a light microscope and we can study their effects and we can study their genetics, etc. So those things include bacteria and fungal cells and
protozoas.
Yeah, and then we have the hypothetical, or what we'd call mythical category, which is viruses, which are submicroscopic in terms of they say that they can't see them with light microscopes, and that's why they have to do all these other indirect studies on them. But to us, it's clear they have no evidence whatsoever that viruses exist. But yeah, perhaps more importantly is to look at the overall picture, because I think people understand how bogus the virus model is when they can see that there's no evidence that microbes have the ability to be pathogenic. Now that means, in this sense, pathogenic means the ability to cause disease, not react to disease or have microbes that change depending on the underlying condition. The concept of pathogenic is that these things can invade healthy tissue. So you could be perfectly well and then you swallow or inhale one of these microbes and then that causes you to become unwell. Now, what we found in our years and years of research on this, and others, Tom Cowan, Andy Kaufman, Mike Stone, and David and Dawn with their book, What Really Makes You Ill. All of us have spent years researching this, looking at the pivotal studies, and we've all concluded the same, that the microbes can't cause illness by themselves. They simply do not. And all of these studies that they've tried to do for 100 years, trying to show that the bugs, these little microbes, cause us to become sick or cause animals to become sick or plants, etc., it's simply not true. The mistake that's been made, well, in some cases mistake, in some cases we think it looks like all-out fraud, is that they are associated with certain conditions, so that if an organism does become unwell, some of the bacteria, which are usually present in very small numbers, suddenly proliferate and become present in very big numbers. And that's the mistake that's been made, because then people say, there we go, it's a smoking gun. But we always use the analogy like firefighters, that most of the time firefighters, there are lots of volunteer firefighters around. Usually they're in plain clothes. We don't necessarily know one when we see them walking down the street. They're amongst us. They're with us all the time. But then if there is a fire, suddenly they all appear and they've got their suits on and trucks and flashing lights and hoses, etc. And they come and they put out the fire. But we don't say, those firemen, they keep causing fires and they're a real pain. We say, yes, they do appear in greater numbers and are more obvious, but only at times when conditions have changed.
Interesting. So maybe these bacteria are on our side. They're not the ones causing the sickness. They're responding to some dis-ease in the body.
And there's a really great example of this actually in Virus Mania, where we talk about the problems with when you try and introduce life without microbes. So they've done studies previously with cows, with cattle, young calves, where they're born by cesarean section. They are born into sterile conditions. Everything's controlled, the food, etc., and they can only survive for 2 weeks before dying.
So yeah, this is an example of why there's been a huge mistake that's been made, and with the theory of what these microbes are doing. And another thing we point out in our new book, The Final Pandemic, is that when you look at the number of cells on and in our body, we're actually outnumbered. Like, the cells that they call human cells are outnumbered by the cells that they call microbes. So isn't this crazy? We know we can't live without them. We know there's no such thing. I find it incredible that people can't see it. Like, the scientists look at the world like it's this war going on between us and them. They don't see how beautiful it is, that we are in this symbiosis and we interact with our environment, and our microbes on us and in us will change depending on the environmental conditions that we encounter. Without them, we're dead. It's clear that we can't get all of our nutrients. We can't be healthy. And I find that this is something that's really important for people to understand, is that the microbes, not only are they not harmful, but they are so essential to our very life.
So, Mark, is the word germs, is that kind of a disparaging way to categorize these microorganisms, do you think?
That's right, yeah. It's really disparaging to these little guys that are trying to help us. And I think, yeah, if we use the word germs in writing, we sometimes put it in quotes so that people know that we don't really view them in such a way. Well, if you look at the original, they're like so many things, and we point this out in our book. If you look at the etymology, the origins of how words develop, I mean, they weren't necessarily disparaging terms initially. Like, germ can also mean something that brings forward new life. And over time, we've had this kind of butchering of the language, and virus is another example. Once upon a time, it meant poison. And we would agree that there are things that you can't see that will poison your body. But eventually, by sort of middle of last century, they completely had changed that word, and it had come to mean the modern conception, which is these particles, genetic material that invade your body and hijack your system. So, yeah, it's really interesting. And I think the more we've done this, the more we've studied the origins of the words that we're talking about, and words like contagion, etc., which have been completely changed over the years.
Coming up, Sam and Mark discuss why germs have been blamed for making us sick and what we can do to bolster our health overall.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
The Nutrition Therapy Institute. NTI, or the Nutrition Therapy Institute, is a school where students learn to nourish themselves first while gaining the knowledge and skills that help guide others on their journey to optimal wellness. NTI's Nutrition Therapist Master Certification Program is a group of 13 courses with a comprehensive science-based curriculum that doesn't pander to conventional mainstream dogmas. Nutrient-dense animal foods, liver, and fermented foods often appear on the recommended foods list. And NTI offers in-person classes on-site just outside of Denver, Colorado. Or you can take the entire program online. There are group options, or you can follow the coursework at your own pace. You choose which learning format works best for you. NTI's flexible scheduling allows you to complete the program in 1 to 3 years. And the owner and director of NTI is a longtime former Weston A. Price Foundation chapter leader who is committed to helping those in the Weston Price community achieve their goal of getting reliable, nonconformist nutrition training. That's why you, as a listener of the podcast, get half off of your first nutrition program course, which is like a $475 savings. Go to ntischool.com/wisetraditions to take advantage of this exclusive offer today and learn more about the school. That's ntischool.com/wisetraditions. And 2 days of truth at Polyface. I am so excited to invite you to the 4th annual 2 Days of Truth event at Polyface Farms, June 14th and 15th. Farmer Joel Salatin, Dr. Sina McCullough, and I are hosting a summit to uncover the truth about detoxing. We've invited to join us Dr. Leland Stillman and Sayer G to speak to why we need to detox and how to go about it. Learn at this summit how to avoid some toxins altogether and how to detox from others. We'll go over how detoxing enhances energy, slows aging, improves sleep, boosts immunity, and how mental and spiritual detoxification fosters clarity, balance, and inner peace. By the end of the 2 days, you will walk away with your own personalized detox plan. If you've ever dreamed of coming to Polyface Farms, make your dreams come true and join us for these 2 days, June 14th and 15th. Go to polyfacefarms.com right now and click on the Education tab for more information and to register today. This event has sold out in the past, so sign up now while early bird pricing is still in effect. That's polyfacefarms.com. This is Hilda Labrada Gore, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Oh, that's so fascinating. But I want to go back to something you said a moment ago. You said that there can be invisible microbes or microorganisms that could affect our health. I'm thinking particularly of some doctor back in the day who, as I recall, he would work with corpses and then he would go and help deliver babies. And he unwittingly was transferring some microbes or something that was affecting the health and the outcomes of these deliveries. Do you know that story?
Yes, that's a story of a physician called Semmelweis, who basically, he was I think a doctor that was an obstetrician that was in the same department where basically doctors would go and deliver babies and then soon after go and do some autopsies, vice versa. And there was a definite association. This is to do with something called hygiene, and I've actually made a video on this as well, the subject. Yeah, being around dead bodies, there are toxins that, of course, that you're interacting with. And by introducing that to new life, to women, to their postpubertal fever. Yeah.
People get confused with this concept, and it's like the difference between if you take a fresh piece of steak and you can eat it basically raw, that's absolutely fine. You won't get sick from that. But if you leave that steak outside for a couple of days in the sun, in the conditions, etc., and it starts to break down, now if you take the meat at that point, you can you can remove all of the microbes off the meat. But if you eat that meat, you will get sick because now it's been broken down into products that are not suitable for human consumption. We know that because we look at it. It looks slimy. Something looks wrong with it. It smells awful, like totally unappealing to us, which is why people, when they try to eat rotten food, start to gag and the body tries to throw it back out. And that's not because it's done anything bad to us at that point, but it's the body knowing that this is not suitable for human consumption. So, and it's the same concept with this washing of the hands. In that case, with Semmelweis, he was touching dead and dying tissue. I mean, some of these were corpses, literally. And so the corpses were breaking down, and some of the biological products that come out of that process, they certainly can get on our hands. And then if we go and put them inside a woman who's giving birth in an invasive kind of way, that could potentially make them incredibly sick. Yeah, so nothing to do with germs. Like what they could have done was remove the germs off those samples and the woman would still get sick. And that's the big difference, is that there are toxins and these toxins do form in nature. And I mean, there are things we know nature's here to help us, but there are also toxins in nature that are incredibly dangerous to us. Luckily, we've been given lots of warnings about them because they stink or they look unappealing or they have certain colors or whatever, and we know not to touch them. So,
right.
Yeah.
And I remember Sally talking in The Contagion Myth, along with her co-author Tom Cowan, about how improved hygiene, clean water, better sanitation improves the health of communities better than obviously any attempts on our part with vaccines and such to stem the sicknesses. Who knows what was going on back in the time of Typhoid Mary? Here they are blaming this robust cook when it may have been anything else that was causing people's health to crash. So apart from hygiene and good sanitation, clean water, what are some other things that you all recommend to bolster our health?
I think it's all the things that Weston A. Price talk about constantly. And you guys do it so well. But I mean, it's things that we all know that have been passed down as a traditional for generations. It's getting outside in the sun, being outside, getting good sleep, and a loving relationship, having the obviously organic food that hasn't been sprayed with glyphosates, being psychologically in a good place. So I think addressing those issues when often people are very unhappy in relationships in their own work environment, and they don't think that will actually make them sick, but over time it will. The body will find a way out if psychologically you can't find a way out.
Yeah, and I think we're very influenced by Dr. Ulrich Williams, who was a New Zealand physician in the 1930s through to about the 1950s, and he rejected allopathic medicine. He was a surgeon and an obstetrician, and halfway through his career, he rejected all of that stuff and became a naturopath. So we sort of followed in his footsteps, and we're very similar. And I think actually Ulrich he knew of Weston A. Price because he mentioned, this is in the 1930s, I think, he's already talking about Weston A. Price. So we're sort of on that same tradition here. And what Ulrich came to the conclusion with was that the diet is so important, as well as other things. But he essentially came up with these 4 principles of health, which we believe in as well. And one is that a lot of people are making dietary mistakes. So they're either eating too much, which is really common, just too many calories, etc. The next problem is that they're eating depleted foods. So despite the fact people think, well, I'm eating fruit and vegetables and I'm eating this and that, the fact is that by the time the food gets to their plate, it's very, very depleted and it doesn't have the health benefits that they think it does. And it's also potentially contaminated by toxins. And Dr. Williams talked about that in the 1930s. He was horrified back then about how processed food was. Now, that's in the 1930s. I mean, they barely had things like plastic and stuff with their foods back then. And you think about what we have now, it's completely different. The next principle he talked about was, dietary was so important first. Next principle he talked about was lack of exercise and lack of getting outside in the sun. So that people thought that they could be healthy by just staying at home, by never really doing a lot of exercise, etc. And unfortunately, with affluence, that became an option for people. They didn't have to walk places. They didn't have to use their bodies much in exercise. The third was, which Sam's talked about, is the psychological component.
Yes.
About particularly finding a pathway that gives you meaning and makes you feel content. And I've got to say, most people we encounter, they struggle on this one and they dismiss it as not that important to physical health, but it is so important. Like, we meet people all the time who hate their jobs, but they say, I'm trained as an accountant or I'm trained as a dentist, and what else would I do? Well, you can actually do something else if you want. If you find that the work's just totally making you feel discontent, there is other options. And number 4 was a spiritual connection, which came to Dr. Williams. That's the reason he changed everything, was because he just felt he had no spiritual connection. He felt that he was selfish and that he was materialistic, and he became ashamed of himself and realized that there was a God, and that instead of serving God, he was serving himself. So I think those 4 guiding points, and they're very widely encompassing, but I think if people come back to those, you can't go wrong.
No. Oh my gosh, they're beautiful. I hadn't heard of them before or of this doctor, so thank you for bringing him up. Now, I just have a few more questions to ask you before we wrap up. One is, even though we've been talking about the wonders of natural choices, a better diet, a better mood, a spiritual connection, and all these things, is there ever a circumstance in which antibiotics are a good idea?
No. Short answer. No. I get asked this question a lot of times in emails, and I always try and point to the person, you have to reflect, why has this happened to you first? And you have to reverse that cause. That antibiotics will work, in inverted commas, if you think about that they suppress symptoms. But ultimately, you haven't addressed the cause, and the problem and usually does come back. The body has an amazing ability to heal itself. But antibiotics, they are anti-life. That's what the word means if you break it down. And it is, we are, like Mark talked about earlier, about where do you distinguish the difference between bacteria and human cells? We are all the same thing. And so you are attacking yourself. So I would always look at, why has this happened? What is the cause? And we get asked about sepsis often. We do monthly question and answers for our viewers. And what would you do in this situation? And I believe that if I was that sick, I'd be looking at things like IV vitamin C and IV fluids if I was in hospital, but I would not want antibiotics. And I would be trying to address, what have I done wrong? There's something that I've made a mistake with here, and it's been serious enough to make me this sick.
Yeah, and I think Sam's got a video called The Truth About Antibiotics, so that's something that people could look at. In that video, we address the problem of, like everything when we start researching, we go to the scientific literature and we poured through it, just trying to find examples of conditions, life-threatening conditions like gangrene, and tried to find examples of where they'd actually done a trial, a proper trial scientifically, to see if antibiotics save lives, and we didn't find any. Now, that's strange, because if they are claiming that they are life-saving pharmaceuticals, wouldn't it be a slam dunk for them just at some stage in the last 70, 80 years to do a study and say, well, it was definite? But instead we have this mythology, like we hear that in World War II, all of the Allies were being saved with the marvels of penicillin, etc. There's no scientific studies that show that. That's just pure mythology that's been propagated for decades now. And the other thing, like Sam says to me, the reason it wouldn't work in terms of the killing of the microbes is that, we're absolutely covered in bacteria. So how are they supposed to be? You've got thousands, tens of thousands of species all over you. How are they supposedly killing one type? And this comes back to the whole concept of the magic bullet. And we mentioned this in a footnote in the new book.
Well, and speaking of magic, I understand that the root word of pharmaceuticals is pharmacopoeia. It's a Greek word, and doesn't it have its origin in a word that is connoted with witchcraft or sorcery?
Deception, etc. Yeah. And we're not sure of the significance of that, but we're mainly concerned with the whole development in the early 1900s of the petrochemical industry and all of its products.
Yes.
And basically they had this quote solution and then went looking for a problem. And the Rockefellers and some of those powerful corporations worked out that there was going to be this huge market if they could get things like germ theory to take in the public. And obviously the medical industry got captured, and the rest is history in terms of how this mythology has been propagated. But we just keep pointing out to people, when you look at your body and your health, you don't have a pharmaceutical deficiency going on. And also, like, we got taught pharmacology for years. It was drilled into us and how medicines are supposed to work, etc. And then we came to the understanding that, oh my God, this is complete nonsense. This is how it works. You swallow a chemical, your body tries to get rid of it. Sometimes that means your blood pressure goes down. Sometimes that means it does something else to your guts, gives you constipation, diarrhea, etc. These are all just the effects of your body trying to get rid of something.
Yes, interestingly, they call them side effects. Again, going back to etymology and the way words sound, side effects sounds better than effects. But honestly, it is effects. And as you're pointing out, Mark, how does the medication know exactly what it's supposed to do and just go to that one spot in the body? It's not going to work like that. It's going to go to different places and cause different things to happen.
Exactly. It's completely bogus. Now, there are a couple of, if someone's listening, there are a couple of isolated examples, like they can make synthetic hormones, for instance, things like insulin, etc., but they mimic stuff that's been already produced by the body. They're just copycat kind of molecules. But any of the petrochemical type derived pharmaceuticals, they are simply intruders in the body, and the body does its best to get rid of them. And it's interesting because I had a conversation with someone who used to be in the pharmaceutical industry and had woken up to all of the fraud going on. And I think he said to me something like, oh, yeah, but I just take something like acetaminophen, Tylenol, and that's about the only thing I take. And I said, don't take that. It's like, A, they don't even know what that does, even within the mainstream medicine system. They say we don't really know how it operates. And 2, we know that your body, as soon as it goes in, tries to detox the molecule and it depletes your glutathione system. So your body treats it as it does with every other poison and activates the glutathione system to get rid of it. So it's incredible that people think a nasal spray or some Tylenol, something over the counter, they think that's perfectly safe, not realizing that their body treats it as an attack.
Oh, wow. This is fascinating. Really excited to get this out. But I have one more question before my final one. And it's this. Can germ theory and terrain theory coexist?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this gets put out to us a lot, this question of whether, oh no, there's something, you take the good and take the good from this. And no, I think they're mutually exclusive. And the reason is because germ theory has a specific reason, is that there is one germ that causes one disease and there's one treatment. Terrain theory is the concept that your terrain is altered and then sickness will come about. It's a completely different way of looking at things. And I think because this issue has been brought to the forefront more and more lately with the freedom community, who can see there are major problems here. And I think it feeds back into germ theory in particular. I know we talked about this last time, but is things like the biolab, bioweapon kind of fake stories that are going on. This is really unhealthy and really dangerous, I think, causing more fear in people. So they can't coexist. What do you think, mate?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, it's a shame. I mean, we say germ theory because that's what everyone in the public calls it, germ theory. But it's not even a theory. So it was the germ hypothesis, and it's been refuted. I mean, we can show people dozens of studies where it's been refuted. Now, remember, with a scientific hypothesis, you only have to refute it once and then it's finished. It can't progress to become a theory. But we know because of the fraud that went on with developing the pharmaceutical industry and vaccines, etc., that they elevated it and said, oh, that's been established as a theory, which means that it hasn't been refuted, which is absolute nonsense. So it's very important for them to propagate this fraud. And also, I mean, it's very specific, as Sam says. They came up with these very specific hypotheses about what bacteria and fungi and imaginary viruses could do. And so it's not necessarily, we don't even have to show that there's an alternative. We just show that the germ theory is incorrect. And I think also, to be clear to people, terrain theory does not make, we probably shouldn't call it a theory either. We should just call it a terrain paradigm, etc., because we're not saying that it's been put forward with specific scientific hypotheses, etc. I think terrain is just a word we use to say that germ theory is incorrect. That's clearly not what's happening. And terrain embraces a wide paradigm of the reasons why people actually get sick and how microbes actually work when they interact in the environment and with us. But yeah, I think for us, what's become the major problem now, and unfortunately this is in health freedom people, is the whole biolab thing, because they don't realize this is like the strongest thing supporting germ theory, is that not only do these germs, are they dangerous, but they can make them even more dangerous and they can fiddle around with them in labs. And I think what they don't realize is that people think, oh, if we expose this to the public, it's going to be great. We're going to cause the whole thing to unravel. No, the reaction will be is that the public will freak out and they'll think that biosecurity needs to be ramped up to the point that people won't be able to travel. They'll have to have passports which indicate if they've been vaccinated or tested, etc. And it's actually moving into something that the globalist organisations really want. They want this extreme biosecurity to restrict what people can do.
And also, can I just say really quickly, this feeds back into your first question about the blame game. Oh, it's come from a lab in Wuhan.
Yeah.
It feeds straight back into that psychology.
Yeah.
It's such a good point. Yeah. And I don't think people had thought through logically, or I'll say for myself, I hadn't thought through. We're feeding into the lie that will put us in a more submissive state, literally, where we as citizens, wherever we may live, are going to be subjugated to more restrictions to ostensibly protect us from these bioweapons.
Exactly. And if people can't see it, I mean, we can give an example in our own country, New Zealand, and I'm sure it's the same in the United States. There are certain animals that if you keep on your farm, they say that they have the right to come onto your property at any time and test the animals, which they say, they're testing them for germs. And if their tests come back positive, they then have the right to kill your animals.
Your entire herd.
Your entire flock on the basis of these tests. And I mean, we know that this happens across the world, Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand. And yeah, it's absolutely, if people can't see what they use as an excuse and how that could be used to an even worse extent on the human population, soon it will be a case of, oh, look at that, you tested positive for this test, which means that now you've got to do this and got to do that before you're even allowed to leave your house again.
Wow.
Again, it buys back into this terrible germ paradigm.
Right, absolutely. Well, you've given us so much food for thought. And now, at the risk of repeating myself, I want to pose to you the question I love to pose at the end. You may have a different answer than last time, but if the listener could do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend?
Well, I'll give a different answer this time.
Okay.
One of the people I follow regularly is Tom Cowan, because he just keeps firing out all these nuggets and you think that's a great idea and you take it on board. So, and I think that's what people really appreciate. It's just little things that you can do each day. Mine would be take a really pure glass of water each day and just squeeze a lemon in there and drink that, because that is magnificent. Much, much better than taking any vitamin C supplement. The supplements do not capture the complex of compounds that nature can produce. And so that would be my advice, particularly to those people that are thinking, well, I'm taking my daily vitamin C natural supplement, etc. I would say stop that and make sure the lemon's organic, obviously. And that's something I do. Ulrich Williams said you're supposed to do it at the start of the day, so I don't do that. I do it more towards the evening. I love it when I'm sitting down in the evening and doing a little bit of work and I just squeeze a lemon into that glass of water. Initially, I thought, oh my goodness, it's so sour. But I've got so used to it. It tastes absolutely delicious now.
Oh, so refreshing. What about you, Sam?
I'm a big fan too of just experimenting on yourself. Like, I don't think you need to do any types of fancy studies. I like to do this, and Mark will say that I'm a fan of trying out different stuff, like no shampoo, or just doing things that you experiment with something, a problem in your life, and thinking, actually, what can I do differently? And at the moment, what I'm trying is just really sourcing as much as I can myself, like learning how to make things myself. I would like to try, I haven't done it yet, is like getting salt from the sea salt, and making that myself. So it's just like little things that you think, I want to try this and just see how it works. And there's always something new to learn. So yeah, that would be my tip.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. It's been a lovely conversation. I've learned so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilda.
Our guests today were Drs. Mark and Samantha Bailey. You can visit their website, drsambailey.com, to learn more. And I am Hilda Labrada-Gore, the host and producer of this podcast for the Weston A. Price Foundation. You can find me at holistichilda.com. And for the transcript for this episode, visit our website, westonaprice.org, and click on the podcast page. And now for a recent review from Apple Podcasts. Anne E.G. said this: "So great. I absolutely love listening to this podcast. It is my go-to in the kitchen, garden, on road trips, etc. It's a great resource for so many topics and has helped transform my family's health and nutrition. 10 out of 10, recommend." And thank you so much for your review. It means a ton. If you want to leave us a review, please go to Apple Podcasts, click on the ratings and reviews, give us as many stars as you'd like, and tell the world why the show is worth listening to. And thank you so much for listening, my friend. Stay well, and remember to keep your feet on the ground and your face to the sun.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.